and gentlemen, we have a special guest joining us today. She's flown all the way from Adelaide. Welcome to cloudy Queensland. I'm sure it's a bit warmer here. Yes. Michell is a senior lecturer in social sciences at the University of Adelaide. Dee has a lived experience herself. She was in care for 15 years from the age of 3. Dee's gone on to build an impressive career. She's co-authored a book entitled The Slow Evolution of Foster Care in Australia, and I believe, Dee, you're currently working on another. As we all know, some of you so particularly well, life can be tricky at times, particularly in such unpredictable times. Dee is going to share her thoughts on how to embrace both our brokenness and our beauty. Would you give Michell a warm welcome?
Thank you, Kay, for that introduction. Yes, I am from Ghanaland, Adelaide, South Australia. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's an incredible privilege and such a pleasure to see a wonderful turnout and to be at an event like this. The title of my paper today is Pouring in the Gold, and I'm going to be using as a metaphor the Japanese practice of kintsugi as a way to think about our lives, as a way we can embrace both our brokenness and our beauty. As the story goes, the practice of kintsugi goes back to the 16th century when the 8th shogun, who was a military dictator appointed by the Japanese emperor, found a crack in his favourite pottery bowl. He sent the bowl to China to be repaired, but when it came back it was clamped together and he wasn't happy with it. He thought it was ugly. So he ordered craftsmen, which he could do because he was the boss man, to do better. From this developed the practice of repairing broken or cracked or chipped pottery, and that could have been bowls or plates or vases. Do you say vases or vases? Do you say vases? Oh, okay. I'll do vases. So those pottery pieces would be repaired with a lacquer that was then dusted with powdered gold or platinum or silver. And the breakage and the subsequent repair then becomes part of the object, something beautiful added to it rather than something to hide. Friends of mine in England who had been raised in what we call out-of-home care, they call it something different, were talking on Twitter one day about kintsugi as a powerful metaphor for their experiences of healing from childhood and adult trauma. In a lovely bit of serendipity, later that same week, I was listening to the Radio National program, Conversations, where Australian-born but London-based adoptee and comedian Deborah Frances-White was talking about seeing an alternative healer. Deborah knew about kintsugi. She told the healer she felt like a broken vase, not a vase, a vase. And she wanted the healer to pour in the gold so that she could be whole again. And the healer responded by saying that Deborah had been pouring in gold as cracks were forming. Deborah could see what the healer was saying. She could see all the ways that she had been working to survive and thrive. Often, she said, we don't realise how much we do at the time that we are being traumatised to heal ourselves. No child should get to adulthood so traumatised they need help to pick up the pieces and put themselves back together again. But as we know, far too many people have childhood experiences that are jaw-droppingly brutal. Sometimes I wonder how people survive, and sometimes in the course of my work, I ask them. Penny, for example, a forgotten Australian in Victoria, told me she survived the ongoing assaults during her childhood by dissociating, by going somewhere else in her head, no matter what was being done to her. I see this as Penny pouring in the gold. This trick she had of going somewhere different in her head allowed her to survive situations that no child should be in. Penny continued pouring in gold as an adult. She learned how to parent by reading and observing other families, and none of her 4 children went into the care system. Legendary silent film actor Charlie Chaplin survived a children's home by dreaming of becoming a great actor. Similarly, American icon Marilyn Monroe, who was in foster care, kinship care, and an orphanage, watched movies and dreamed of being a film star. The great Charles Dickens was determined to maintain connections with his family when they were in debtor's prison and he was left in foster care. He was 12 years old, working 6 days a week in a black ink factory, and then did a 19-kilometre round trip walking to see his family on his one day off. Australian examples of victim survivors who were pouring in gold as cracks appeared include the following. Archie Roach's Scottish foster father taught him traditional Scottish ballads. When he was a homeless teenager, he met Ruby Hunter, who'd also been stolen from her family, and she encouraged him to transmute his pain into writing and singing songs. Opera singer Stephen Smith was also a homeless teenager when he met young refugees, and they introduced him to rhythm and blues and hip-hop, and when he was 17, Stephen started taking music lessons while working in a fruit and veg store. Poet Robert Adamson was in juvenile detention centres and prisons on and off for 10 years from the age of 12. What kept him going when he was in solitary confinement were memories of his nighttime visits to Taronga Park Zoo, illegally I might add. He used to sneak in there. Introduced to the music of Bob Dylan in prison, he began writing poems there too. Winner of the first The Voice Australia competition, Carice Eden, was inspired at the age of 12 by a documentary about Janis Joplin, who affirmed the quality of her own voice. And then as a teenager, she was taught to play guitar by her foster father, Frank. Singer-songwriter Diana Gosper had a nomadic childhood with stints in children's homes and foster care, and she found comfort in writing song lyrics from the age of 9 and taught herself to play guitar at the age of 12. Footballer, AFL player, Josh Jenkins loved playing basketball as a child in foster care, and that kept him going. And he persisted despite hostility because he was a foster kid, and even though he often felt isolated and disappointed because he went to games alone. And he didn't start playing in the AFL until he was in his 20s. In 1958, Faith Thomas was the first Aboriginal Australian to represent Australia in any sport, playing cricket here in Brisbane against England. And she talks about being in a children's home where the kids learned to play cricket by making their own bats and using round stones as balls. And she learned to bowl by throwing rocks at galahs, which I'm not sure is a good idea, but there you go. Do you sometimes feel like a broken vase? How did you pour in gold as you were growing up, becoming an adult during later years? What I did as a child, and my experiences were nowhere near as harsh as those Penny-faced or some of the others I've mentioned, was to read stories. If I'd been allowed to watch television, I would have done that, but I wasn't. So reading was one way I had of pouring in gold. And for me, reading was both education and escape. I could climb inside a book and get away from life for a while. Reading fiction was my way of coping with being removed from my biological family at the age of 3 and being placed first, but briefly, in a children's home and then into foster care. I was fortunate to have a younger sister with me, but I soon lost contact with 3 brothers and an older sister. My parents were imprisoned for several months for the neglect of their children, and I never saw my mother again. I have only dim memories of occasionally seeing my father before he agreed I be adopted, but I was never adopted. I read loads of Enid Blyton stories when I was a kid and longed to go to boarding school. My favourite character, though, was Anne Shirley. Anne of Green Gables was written by Canadian writer Lucy Maud Montgomery. It was published in 1908 and set in 1878 in a Canadian province. And it tells the story of Anne Shirley, who is sent to siblings Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert by mistake. The Cuthberts wanted a boy to help out on the farm, but Anne gets to stay once they hear about the brutality and overwork the 12-year-old had already gone through in orphanages and foster care. We can tell from that one story that life for kids in care has long been difficult, not only in Australia, but in other British colonies. I adored Anne Shirley. She was feisty, imaginative, smart, adaptable, and talkative, far more talkative than me. But I think we were both quite capable in the school ground of standing up to bullies. I didn't know at the time that Montgomery was drawing on her own experiences to write Anne of Green Gables. She was a toddler when her mother died, and her father left her with maternal grandparents. He stayed on Prince Edward Island, but moved to mainland Canada when Maud, she hated being called Lucy, when Maud was 7. Around the same time, Maud's grandparents took in 2 boys who'd been in kinship care with an aunt, but who lived with Maud and her grandparents for 3 years. Until those boys arrived, Lucy Maud Montgomery was a lonely, isolated child. She taught herself to read by the age of 4 and constructed her own fantasy world, playing with dolls and cats. Hating being a charity case, she was determined to financially support herself and sent off her first story for publication at the age of 12. I wish I'd known about Lucy Maud Montgomery when I was reading Anne of Green Gables. She would have been a really significant role model for me. But I made do with Anne, and perhaps it was she who inspired me to have a go at university, but it might also have been the Whitlam-era conversations about free university when I was in high school. Because I was in the one foster home for 15 years, and as problematic as that home could be, I only had one primary school and one high school. And school was my sanctuary. It was pure gold. Friends, kind and encouraging teachers, libraries. And unusually, I didn't have to leave school at 15. I was able to stay on and matriculate, as doing year 12 was called back then. Although I had an offer to go to university, I didn't go straight away. Life had become chaotic as I turned 18, rejected the way my foster mother saw me, left home. Even at that difficult time when I couldn't do much, gold was being poured in. A boss and his wife offered their spare bed for a while and helped me find a home of my own. Over the next decade or so, I disappeared into the middle class. I rarely talked about having been in foster care. I was too busy correcting the supposed fault of coming from a working class background. I changed the way I spoke, the way I dressed, and I tried to catch up on some of the so-called high culture I needed to pass as middle class. Like Walter Jacobson after he donned a suit, and Jacobson was in care in Victoria early in the 20th century, changing myself meant the stigma of both foster care and working class was still there, but now it was more private and more bearable. What I learned from that, though, was that papering over the cracks instead of repairing the vase results in collapse. On the surface, my life was good. I was in a long-term relationship, had a well-paid job and a supportive workplace, but I was miserable. By then, my oldest daughter was about 3, and I'd recovered from postnatal depression, not that postnatal depression was spoken about back in 1983. For me, significant family events, the birth of each of my 3 children, the birth of my grandchildren, and even the recent wedding of my son, are sources of both immense joy, and they result in the vase cracking again. Joy and re-traumatisation, joy and grief, joy and the pain of knowing what I know now and what I could have done better as a mother. Is there anything more distressing than becoming aware of the wounding you've passed on, unwittingly, unconsciously, unthinkingly, to those you love the most? I sit amongst the shards, studying the cracks and the chips and feeling broken, ashamed, guilty, sad. I even poke myself with the sharp pieces. The cracks, wrote Canadian singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen, are how the light gets in. Sometimes the light comes in the form of a good cry. Sometimes it comes in the form of a reminder from my partner that our children are thriving. They are all decent, capable, and competent adults. I rise, I rise, I rise. Those are words from the phenomenal African-American poet Maya Angelou. I rise, I rise, I rise. The first time Maya went to live with her grandmother, she was only 3 years old. She and her 4-year-old brother were put on a train like a couple of parcels and sent off to another state, just the two of them. I rise, I rise, I rise. Getting up, pouring in gold to mend the vase, is an act of defiance. It is bold disobedience. It is open resistance to those who expect little to nothing from people who've been in state care. It is my way of sticking up both middle fingers to the naysayers, to the abusers, to the child protection system. I went to university in 1994, 15 years after I'd first dropped out. The Department for Women's Studies at the University of Adelaide had been there for just 2 years, and I felt at home in women's studies because of feminist principles such as the personal is political. What I mean by that is that what usually happens to us as children reflects larger social, cultural, historical, and political goings-on. For example, colonisation, wars, domestic violence, treating children as property, a lack of support for single mothers until the 1970s, male entitlement and lack of self-control, the ridiculous notion that there could be legitimate and illegitimate children, and the practice of trying to beat the bad out of children. In other words, our brokenness usually comes from the public world impinging on our private lives. Yet all too often, victims are blamed for what happened to them, and often we blame ourselves. My arrival on campus at the University of Adelaide coincided with a boom in what is called the memoir industry, the publication of autobiographies of childhood exposing the events and impact of prejudice, poverty, and violence against children. This personal storytelling, including via government inquiries, and I know that many of you have been involved in those, emboldened formerly marginalised groups of people like us. And for me, this trend was gold. First, I no longer felt so alone. Being the abused can be the loneliest place on earth, said Isabella Murray for the ABC in response to Grace Tame becoming Australian of the Year. Second, books like Auntie Rita by Jackie Huggins gave me, a white fella, confidence to speak out, and I began, tentatively, including snippets of my story in some assignments, acutely aware that I wasn't removed because of racist policies. Third, getting through my studies gave me the skills to join this publication trend and to write longer pieces about my experiences. And I was 44 years of age before I had my first story published. Writing is my way of cleaning up the pieces of the vase in preparation for pouring in the gold. It is catharsis, a release. I write and sob. I sob and write. Back in 2009, I wrote my first story about another former foster kid, Muhammad, the founder of Islam. According to British writer Karen Armstrong, when Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570 of the Common Era, children were often given out to foster parents in the desert because it was thought to be healthier for them than in the city. Muhammad's father had died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6, and he then lived with a grandfather and later on with an uncle. Karen Armstrong says that being an orphan reduced Muhammad's status in the community, making it difficult for him to achieve success as a merchant. And I couldn't help but be impressed how that orphan, who'd been looked down on, had gone on to found an international religion. Over the next 9 years, I collected many stories of people who'd been displaced from their families, like those I've already mentioned, and including Aboriginal Australian activist Charlie Perkins, French fashion designer Coco Chanel, and Australian pioneering pilot Horry Miller, after whom there are roads named in Perth and Adelaide. These people, these characters and stories I wrote extended the sense of community I'd first experienced when I connected with Clan in 2004, and obviously I don't mean the Ku Klux Klan. Belonging to a community is gold. Organisations like Lotus Place are gold. Community gave me what social work academic Margaret Pack calls vicarious resilience. Learning about how other members of my community have coped with the trauma of disrupted and all too often dehumanising childhoods is encouraging, validating, energising, inspiring. Gold. In 2018, I began a blog called Real Life Superheroes, and this was inspired by the work of Ethiopian British poet Lem Sisse, who was in foster care and children's homes in England. One of the ways I see Lem pouring in gold for himself and pouring out gold for others has been by drawing attention to the many popular fictional characters who've been in out-of-home care. I've talked about Anne Shirley, then there's Harry Potter, Superman, James Bond, Lisbeth Salander and the girl with the dragon tattoo. But as we all know, children, actual children and young people in out-of-home care are never seen as heroes. That's not to say that kids in care don't have to develop and use, as Lem says, extraordinary skills to deal with extraordinary situations on a daily basis. They do, but the skills are rarely noticed. Their capacity for greatness or goodness is not often acknowledged by those who care for the children or by the wider community. Instead, what we hear most frequently is a relentless deficit discourse about children and young people in care and those who've left. It's distressingly true that care leavers are overrepresented in the prison, homeless and mentally unwell populations, and shame on the state for this. But if this is the only story we ever hear about kids in care, and it is the dominant one, then even well-meaning advocates are feeding into stereotypical views of care leavers as losers. In a riff on French philosopher Lucy Irigaray advice to women, we need a nourishing environment, the soil of structural change, to nurture, to grow up children who are in care. But we also need the air, the sun, the light of inspiration, so they aim high. Far better to aim high and miss the mark than aim low and be on target. My blog was about actual people rather than fictional characters, actual people who were displaced from their birth families during childhood. These are people who have defied low social expectations and gone on to live rich and interesting lives. Many are famous because those stories are easily available, but in the current project I'm working on, we're talking to less well-known, but equally amazing Australians. We're all more than our childhoods. A hero is an ordinary individual who finds the strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles. And that's a quotation attributed to Christopher Reeve, the American actor who played Superman in the 1978 film and its first 3 sequels. My heroes are you. My heroes are you who have experienced racist interventions, childhood spent in the out-of-home care system, abused while in the supposed care of institutions, being forced to relinquish children, the loss of your families and disconnection from your communities. You might be feeling like a broken vase, but I hope you take the time today to reflect on the gold you've been pouring in over the years. Thank you.
Dee. What a thought-provoking, slightly provocative, but really thought-provoking and uplifting address. You've really made a lot of us think, and you've touched a lot of touch points there. You've touched a lot of hearts. Interesting to know the company that many out of home care children were in, with those famous names there. The human spirit, though, is very strong, and it's amazing how it can heal. We all do that in different ways. But thank you for your really insightful talk, and thank you for pouring some gold in today with your contribution.